You're watching This Week in Louisiana Politics with Fred Childers.
Good Sunday morning to you. I'm Fred Childers. Thanks for joining us for This Week in Louisiana Politics on your local election headquarters. We have a lot to get to. A multi-million-dollar contract to replace Louisiana's voting machines has been canceled by the state. The process to award that contract has been plagued with controversy and has even become a debating point in the contentious race for Secretary of State. That's the office in charge of elections all throughout Louisiana. Now, you might recall Secretary of State Kyle Ardoin, who is also a candidate to keep that job, met scrutiny after Dominion Voting Systems won the bid to replace the machines. A complaint from one of the losing bidders claimed the process was rigged to benefit Dominion. Ardoin defended the process, saying it was fair. According to reports from the AP, Louisiana's Chief Procurement Office canceled the contract after finding, quote, flaws. Now, just a few weeks out from election time, Ardoin's office will now have to rebid the entire contract. And now it's Ardoin who is complaining, and he's taking aim at the governor. Here's his statement, in part via email. The decision by Governor Edwards' administration is an embarrassment and reeks of old-school Louisiana politics. The governor sided with his political buddies over election security. This bombshell comes at a rough time for Ardoin. His job will be on the line in just a few weeks as Louisianans prepare to pick a full-time Secretary of State. Even in the days before this development, the contract talks had already become campaign fodder. Capitol correspondent Harrison Golden explains.
I can't help them understand the process.
Acting Secretary of State Kyle Ardoin defending how his office went shopping for new voting machines.
When you hit front runner status, you always know when, because they're all hitting you.
While those seeking his job as Louisiana's chief elections officer declare sticker shock.
I think that it's high time that we have a fresh set of eyes.
A public servant should avoid the appearance of impropriety.
We cannot tolerate any more scandals in government, and particularly in the Secretary of State's office.
State officials told vendors they wanted to double the number of voting machines to as many as 20,000. But because that plan had not been publicized, it shot up the price tags by millions. The winning bidder, Dominion Voting Systems, says buying the machines would cost $95 million. Ardoin's opponents argue that's far beyond the $40 to $60 million that he estimated earlier this year in committee.
When you testify in front of House and Governmental Committee and you give somebody your word, keep your word, then the next time around, we won't have to doubt it.
They are solely trying to create baloney.
Ardoin firing back, maintaining the deal is not yet final, and that Dominion's price tag could still change. That all depends on exactly how many machines Louisiana buys or leases and how hard state government can bargain.
We haven't even negotiated it. This is a sticker price thing. You never pay sticker price on a car. We're not going to pay sticker price now.
If the state does pay $95 million to Dominion, it would still be more than $20 million lower than proposals by the two contenders not chosen, according to bid files. Though personnel with those two companies, Hart and Election System and Software, say they did offer less expensive options not included in those documents. For your local election headquarters, I'm Harrison Golden.
But again, this bidding process will have to start all over. Monday's Secretary of State Forum at the Belle of Baton Rouge came less than a month before voters pick someone to lead that office full time. Election Day is November 6th with a runoff possible December 8th. A new position designed to protect the state's elections in cyberspace has been created by Louisiana Secretary of State Kyle Ardoin. Tuesday, Ardoin announced that the current Information Technology Division Director, Scott Mayers, will now also serve as the Chief Information Security Officer. He'll design and carry out cybersecurity initiatives and advise on cybersecurity policy and legislation. Cybersecurity became a concern for voters during the 2016 presidential election due to the news of election data breaches and Russian interference. Now for an election a little further down the road, but important nonetheless. Governor John Bel Edwards officially has a challenger for the 2019 governor's race. We've seen several potential candidates talk about running, but this one is official. Take a look. Baton Rouge businessman and Republican Eddie Risponi filed the necessary paperwork with the Louisiana Ethics Administration on Wednesday. He reportedly told the Associated Press that he is definitely running. And we've reached out to Risponi and invited him onto our show to have a chat with him about his campaign. He says he'll consider it. Naturally, we hope he says yes, and we look forward to that conversation. Other possible candidates we've spoken to about running include Republican U.S. Senator John Kennedy and Attorney General Jeff Landry, also a Republican. They, however, have not officially filed to run. And speaking of polls, now with the upcoming redistricting in 2021 and 2022, Republican and Democratic Party leaders know the stakes are high. Governors have lots of influence over policy that shape those districts. So let's take a look at the governor's races across the country. According to JMC Analytics and polling, of the currently held 26 Republican seats, there are 5 toss-up seats where polling data suggests it's too close to call. They include Georgia, Kansas, Nevada, Ohio, and Oregon. By the way, Oregon could flip from Democrat to Republican, unlike the other 4 states. Again, Louisiana's governor's race will take place in November of 2019. And speaking of polls, we're talking to pollster John Couvillon about the midterm elections and what it would take for Democrats to take control of the House in November. After that, we'll have a look back at the contentious Kavanaugh confirmation. That's next on your local election headquarters. Stay with us.
This is your local election headquarters.
Welcome back to This Week in Louisiana Politics. I'm joined by John Couvillon with JMC Analytics and Polling. And John, we've spoken to you before about this. You have so much data and research on the midterm elections coming up in November. You've been looking at all of the House races and the Senate races. We're going to focus in on the House races now because we know that the Republicans' control of the House is in jeopardy, or that's what a lot of people are saying. So in your research, first of all, let's go over some of the basics. How many seats in the House would have to flip for Democrats to take control?
So you'd have to have a net gain of 23 seats, meaning that Republicans would have to lose at least 23 seats more than you'd have offset by any pickups of Democratic seats. So a net loss of 23 seats for the Republicans is what it would take to change control of the House.
Which is interesting too, and some of your research covers this, that in order to do that, Democrats would also have to hold on to all their seats, and that's not a foregone conclusion.
Right. Even in landslide years, you typically have a few seats that flip the other way. There's 4 in specific I'm looking at that are Minnesota and Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm. Now, a couple dozen Republican seats are what you would call very close, but you've identified 14 races where the Republicans are actually trailing. What's going on with those races?
So what's happening here, these are House seats where using a combination of presidential election voting and publicly released polling, I'm seeing these seats are where the Republicans are substantially behind, substantially being 5 percentage points or more. And so given that you have that many seats, and by the way, that's only of polling where we know of, there's kind of this underworld, so to speak, of races where there's not been any publicly released polling. So I've actually projected that 14 or so seats is actually in the low 20s, with an additional 60 seats that are too close to call. So in other words, you have a very unfavorable electoral situation for the Republicans this year, based on information I'm seeing not only from election results, but polling as well.
So they could actually lose control of the House?
It's very possible, yes.
Yeah. Any of the seats in Louisiana in jeopardy for losing because I think, what, 6 Republicans?
Five Republicans and a Democrat,
yeah,
yes.
and a Democrat. Any chance that any of those seats could flip?
I'm not expecting any. In fact, what I would fully expect is that all 6 incumbents, the Democrat and 5 Republicans, should win their November primaries with no races being forced into a runoff.
Just a little background on your research. You have 3 categories for this research. What are those?
So what I'm looking at, from looking at presidential election voting in 2016 for each and every congressional district, I've identified seats that I've classified that are substantially at risk of flipping, those that are moderately at risk of flipping, and those that are minimally at risk of flipping. And it's all based on what the Trump percentage is. So it's not a perfect gauge, but it's a very good theoretical one, given that you have more and more straight ticket voting occurring in America nowadays.
So it's just interesting that the Democrats would need 23 seats, but you've really only identified 14 races where the Republicans are trailing, and they might lose, you know, it might flip the partisan lines. So what else would have to happen for the Democrats? I mean, if they get those 14 seats, they're obviously going to need more.
So what would have to happen? Keep in mind that the 14 is only looking at the several dozen House races, rather, where we have identified polling. There's also a huge underworld of districts where there's not been any polling. You always have a surprise in a wave election that nobody ever saw coming. So that's number one for things that would have to happen. The other thing, too, that would have to happen would be those toss-up seats flipping to the Democrats, and that's certainly not a foregone conclusion. A lot depends on the strength and weakness of the political tides in that district.
Are we seeing a Kavanaugh effect for the Republicans?
So what's interesting is I've been watching what's been happening ever since the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings got more controversial. I'm seeing it more as solidifying existing partisan leanings, meaning that in Republican-leaning districts, Republicans are more amped up. In the Democratic-leaning districts, the Democrats are much more motivated. The challenge, of course, is the independents, who thus far have not been favorable for Republicans. So in other words, I don't think that the Kavanaugh nomination fracas will really affect things either way, other than to amplify what's already in place right now.
All right, it's very interesting. We only have a few weeks until the November election, the midterm elections.
In fact, over 180,000 people have early voted as we're speaking, and that's actually for states that have released such numbers. I suspect as we're speaking it's more like 400,000 of early voting, and of course Louisiana starts in 2 weeks.
And that's like gold for you pollsters, because those are hard numbers. You can actually look at those and tell how people are voting.
Well, not how they're voting, but you can get an idea from looking at where the early votes are coming from and or the partisan registration, who's more enthused about voting and who is less enthused.
Yeah, interesting. All right, great information. Thank you, John.
Pleasure.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
This is your local election headquarters.
Welcome back. Justice Brett Kavanaugh was ceremoniously sworn into the United States Supreme Court last Monday at the White House. Justice Kavanaugh was sworn in by retiring Justice Kennedy, who Kavanaugh once clerked for and will replace on the bench. President Trump began the ceremony by apologizing to Kavanaugh on behalf of the U.S. for, quote, how he was treated during his confirmation process. Kavanaugh was officially sworn in to the Supreme Court last Saturday after the Senate narrowly confirmed his nomination following an FBI probe into allegations of sexual assault.
Inspired by my mom, who was a trailblazer for women in the law, I've worked hard throughout my career to promote the advancement of women. Women still face many barriers in the American workplace, and all of us have a responsibility to address that problem. During my 12 years on the D.C. Circuit, a majority of my law clerks were women.
He was joined by his wife and 2 daughters at the ceremonial White House event. A law professor from Southern University talked to the Ronald Reagan luncheon crowd on Tuesday about that controversial confirmation process. As mentioned, the conservative judge was accused of sexual assault back in the 80s and was narrowly confirmed down party lines for the most part. Law professor Michelle Getty, who was a fellow at the U.S. Supreme Court in 2012, told the crowd that Kavanaugh will simply interpret the law, and he'll do so from a historical perspective.
What I know for sure, what I think all of us know for sure from what he said and from his opinions and the way he's ruled, he's a strict constructionalist, which means that he looks to the words first.
Getty said Kavanaugh will be conservative, no doubt, but Justice Clarence Thomas is likely the most conservative judge on the 9-member panel right now. Legislation has been signed into law that promises to help you save money when buying prescription drugs. President Trump signed off on the Know the Lowest Price Act and the Patient Right to Know Drug Price Act. Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy helped draft the legislation and says they will end pharmacies' ability to hide certain prices for prescription drugs. Cassidy says that eliminating gag clauses will help you see the true cost of those drugs. The Senate passed a bill earlier this week that should help states avoid the destruction we experienced in the 2016 flood. Senator John Kennedy says parts of the America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2016 is the first step toward deepening navigation channels across Louisiana. Kennedy added that Congress also needs to reform the National Flood Insurance Program to make it more affordable. The airline industry collects billions of dollars every year from passengers for everything from changing their flight plans to checking luggage. As part of the FAA reauthorization that passed last week, some lawmakers wanted to rein in the fees. But Drew Petrimo reports that effort was killed after an intense lobbying effort by the airline industry.
$7.4 billion. That's how much U.S. air travelers paid last year to change flight plans, check bags, and select seats.
Why are the airlines charging these fees? The answer? Because they can.
Democratic Senator Edward Markey from Massachusetts and Republican Senator Roger Wicker from Mississippi want to change that.
This is price gouging in its purest form.
The senators added a provision to the FAA funding bill instructing the agency to determine whether airlines are truly gouging passengers or if the fees are in line with the cost for airlines. But the effort met heavy resistance from the airline industry that argued it would force them to raise base ticket prices and threaten their ability to turn a profit.
The airline industry launched a ferocious lobbying blitz against our bipartisan fair fees provision.
The airline industry holds considerable clout on Capitol Hill, having donated more than $2.5 million to members of Congress over the last 2 years. When congressional negotiators produced a final version of the bill, the crackdown on fees was stripped out.
There are some consumer protections in there now. There weren't as many as I advocated.
In a statement, Airlines for America, an industry trade group, praised the removal of the fair fees bill, saying without this provision, the affordability and accessibility of air travel will continue to thrive for millions of flyers. Proponents promise to continue the fight, believing momentum will build as fees rise. In Washington, I'm Drew Petrimo.
Education Secretary Betsy DeVos wants to allow schools to use federal funds to arm teachers. DeVos is prepared to allow states and school districts to purchase guns and pay for firearm training with Every Student Succeeds Act money. Washington correspondent Morgan Wright reports Democratic senators say they speak for teachers and school administrators when they say this is a bad idea.
Some Democratic senators are expressing concern for Education Secretary Betsy DeVos's proposal to use federal dollars to arm teachers.
In her confirmation hearing, she said to me that she thought teachers needed to be armed against potential grizzly bears. As it turns out, she wasn't joking.
Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy says DeVos's proposal is a terrible idea.
If more guns made a place safer, then America would be the safest country in the world. We're not.
Senator Murphy introduced an amendment to block the Department of Education from allowing school districts to use federal funds to purchase firearms for teachers, but Senate Republicans blocked that vote. Tennessee Senator Lamar Alexander says states get to choose how they use the money.
As I read the law, Title IV specifically gives states the decision about spending their money.
But Democrats argue that is not what the money is for.
Intended to be used for purposes like helping more children get access to mental health care or providing additional programming in STEM or the arts, not for purchasing weapons.
Brenda Shum with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law.
Increased police presence and gun presence in our schools is not just counter-intuitive in terms of creating a safe and healthy learning environment, but our students don't want it.
Shum says having guns in schools undermines students' rights to attend a safe learning environment. In Washington, Morgan Wright.
Coming up, a look ahead for the events that are coming up in Baton Rouge next on your local election headquarters.
This is your local election headquarters.
Well, This Week in Louisiana Politics is all about giving you a preview of what you can expect in the coming week. Taking a look at the schedule this week, on Monday, LSU President F. King Alexander will give a talk to the Press Club of Baton Rouge, where he's expected to discuss the university's ongoing strategic plan. Thank you for joining us for This Week in Louisiana Politics. I'm Fred Childers. I'll see you next Sunday right here on your local election headquarters.